Hi, I'm Norm Bacall, and I am a rewired lawyer, an author, and a TED Talker. I'm here to share with you the exciting elements of my life because I've done things I never could have imagined. I stepped out of the shadows of a boardroom where I was a nobody and eventually led boardroom meetings, became pals with a couple of prime ministers, rock stars, and media moguls in Los Angeles. I went through a collapse, a business collapse that had me question my own identity and how they were interlinked. I've lived by one philosophy, and that is, I'm never going to do it until I do it. Come join me on today's journey.
Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Norman Bacall. Norman built an iconic Canadian law firm that was home for 2 retired Canadian prime ministers. He was a very successful lawyer with a very successful law firm representing film companies and financing and all kinds of really cool stuff. And then in 2014, he didn't retire, he rewired himself. Became a consultant for professional firms. He became a speaker and an author. He became the author of 2 nonfiction books and 2 fiction books. We'll talk a bit about that as well in this next part. But he took this amazingly powerful company with, like I said, with these ex-prime ministers, and the company crashed. It fell apart. He told us in part 1 about how it was described as the what was it you said? The
greatest failure in Canadian law firm history.
Right, the greatest failure.
Imagine that appearing on the banner of the Globe and Mail.
So that's not what you want on your resume. We talked about that. He talked about how, and this was an important piece right at the beginning, we talked about how, he had his identity locked in with his career and his business, and that was a really huge wake-up call for him. We talked about how he had a relationship with Gene Simmons of Kiss, and how Gene went on to do an endorsement of his book, which is pretty cool. You can actually find it on his Twitter page. You'll see a picture of it. That's pretty cool. And he learned about this metaphor that he uses about putting your boat in the water and not just going with the flow, but steering your boat. And the wake-up call he had around that from his wife, so the business collapsed, and then he had to, he was all pissed off, which is normal and natural, about what had happened. And then having been sat down by his wife and really having to look in the mirror of what his part in all this was the transformational piece. So let's jump back into part 2. By the way, if you missed part 1, it's really great. Go back. Just click on the button, go back. It's one show below. You can go listen to it. Honestly, you'll really find it valuable. Let's jump in a little bit further, because you talked about doing one thing. So I talked about people want to change and they often don't change. It feels overwhelming. There's too many things to change, as opposed to what's the one thing I can change in this moment. You've gone on to do these things. You had the law firm, you were doing tax law. You went from being the quiet guy in the corner to being the guy leading the meetings. You've gone away from that to become a speaker, the TEDx guy, et cetera, et cetera. And then you took on something that most people would never consider. I mean, it's one thing. Like, first of all, if you told me you're writing a memoir, I'd say you're insane. Nobody is interested. Nobody cares. Unless you are a YouTube star, unless you are an Instagram star, nobody's really interested. But you did that, and you were very successful with that. But you then took on the idea of fiction, which that's a whole nother level of crazy, taking on fiction writing. I've got friends in the publishing industry who are like, yeah, fiction. No, thanks. Not interested. No, you can sell it as long as you've been selling fiction for 20 years and we know who you are, but otherwise, no. Talk to us a little bit about, why you decided to go into that world, and what was that like for you? Did you even understand what you were confronting?
It's like everything else in my life. If I knew then what I knew now, what I know now, perhaps I never would have started.
Right.
But it was the same about running a law firm. The one thing I swore at age 35, I swore to myself I was never going to become the managing partner of a law firm. It was a thankless job. And from what I could see of my predecessors, something I was never going to succeed at. And yet, 5 years later, I took over because my predecessor discovered suddenly he had terminal cancer and somebody had to do it.
Right.
And so I learned how to do it by the seat of my pants. And over time, I learned how to do it the hard way. And I actually came to love it. When I was 41, I took my wife, who I really owe all my career success to, and that came out of part one. I took her on it was her 40th birthday. We went to Amsterdam and Paris. And while in Paris, I was reading Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient. And when I was halfway through, I turned to her and I said, I am never going to write a book. Because I don't have any level of talent. I can write like a lawyer, but that's pretty much all I can do.
But let's put a pause in that for a minute. Isn't that the catalyst for you doing everything? I'm never gonna. Like, that should be tattooed on your arm with an ellipses. I'm never gonna, but I definitely will. By the way, that's the title of your next book. I'm never gonna.
Actually, thank you.
But I definitely will.
Thank you. As a matter of fact, my third nonfiction, I'm just finalizing the title. And that's it. It's sold. It's sold.
There you go. We got it.
I never really liked the one I have. So
there you go. You got it now.
Thank you. This alone was worth the price of admission, though. But in terms of book writing, you're right. It's the same thing that had driven me. So as I mentioned in the last episode, writing had become an obsession by the time I'd finished writing Breakdown, which was the career memoir. And it was my wife who turned to me and said, you know how to write a story. And clearly I knew how to write one where I was the protagonist and lead character. And it was my story. She said, well, why don't you try writing some fiction? And after fighting her for a while, because I remembered the promise I made, she said, go read some Shakespeare and see if you get inspired. And I came back to her a couple of weeks later and I said, okay, I've got it. I'm going to write Othello, the New York M&A lawyer. So reset in Manhattan.
Wow.
And off I went. And I figured I had a process. I had a book that was actually was a successful nonfiction. So I must be able to do this. So I wrote it. And when I got to the part where I was going to have Othello strangle Desdemona, in this case, his modern day New York wife, I told her I was about to write it, and she said, "You can't." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because if you write a book where the leading man kills the leading lady 1/3 into your book, nobody's buying that book. I can tell you as a woman."
Mm-hmm.
So I said, "Well, I have to kill somebody." So she said, "Well, kill somebody else then." And that was the beginning of my career as a murder mystery novelist. Literally, it was as simple as that. So I went about figuring it out. And when I had a manuscript I thought was acceptable, I sent it off to my breakdown editor. And I said, "Listen, would you mind reading it? I know you only do nonfiction. I just want to know if I'm on the right track." So she calls me back 2 weeks later, and we get on the phone call. And the phone call begins with, "Norm, I think you've written a really fascinating story. And if you want to be a very well-regarded amateur, this will do."
Mm.
And I could feel the steel edge sliding like a shiv between my ribs. Yeah. Like, I don't think she could have said anything that would have killed me more than that line.
Yeah. So
she said, "Listen, there are all kinds of skills you need to learn to be an effective fiction writer, and you don't have any of them."
Oh, that sounds familiar from part one of the show.
Yeah, exactly. So she pointed me in the direction. We started with Fiction for Dummies, and then I went on to read Stephen King's book on fiction, and then I read Robert McKee, And all the while I was
Story.
rewriting. And then I picked up some of my favorite authors and began to read not the books, but sections, paragraphs, sentences to understand what tricks they were playing on their readers. And suddenly my eyes began to open. In the same way as when I was designing film tax shelters, my tax financings, suddenly I would get a dose of inspiration from I don't even know where it was coming from, and I began to understand in fact just how bad my first that draft was. But there was just a function of there's just so many things you have to learn to become an acceptably good fiction writer. And of course, the more I wrote, the better I got. And the reviews when Odell's Fall came out actually exceeded my expectations. But when I wrote the sequel, which was actually a prequel, called Ophelia, which was a modernized Hamlet. I spent it's about the murder of the untimely death of the head of a huge generic pharmaceutical empire, who dies in mysterious circumstances, and his son is absolutely convinced his father's been murdered. The son happens to be a drug addict. But as I was writing it, I could see my level of writing was continuing to improve, and it was because the little flashes you get in your head of inspiration, they come more frequently, but B, you start to actually understand what you're doing, and that's what I could see. I was becoming this person that 5 years ago I could never imagine as an author.
But that's the central theme here, right? I mean, when we talked about this, becoming the person you could never imagine yourself to be, as I said, this idea, I'm never going to until I do, right? So that is the really, in many ways, when I talk to you and being a part one about the meaning of your life, the subjective meaning of your life is I'm never going to until I do. And it's almost like what I'm hearing is that it's almost this fervent conviction of not doing it that suddenly gets, by whatever means, flipped. And you become, and this is what I'm hearing, you become systematic. So some people would go, shit, I said I would never do it. I've tried it. I'm crap at it. Okay, I'm done. Some people would go, okay, I said I would never do it, but yeah, I'm going to try it. I'll try it. I'm kind of crappy at it. I'll see if I can get better. I'll practice. And then there are people who, like you, say, what is the system? Like when I hear you speak about it, I can hear how much of a systems guy you are, that you design systems for writing, that you've designed systems for it. You and I talked about how you designed systems for your, when you did your TED presentation. You break things down into systems. So if our listener is listening and saying, okay, this guy's professing that I can become something I had never imagined, how do I start designing a system to do that?
You have to start with finding your innate talents, because I'm not going to kid around and say, for example, I wish I could be a concert pianist, but I know I can't get I could practice for hours upon hours. I can't get my fingers to work properly. And I figured that out pretty young. So that wasn't for me. I can't be an artist because instinctively from about the age of 9, I didn't like it.
Right.
So yes, my wife who's an artist, she's a retired CA who became a CPA who became an artist. She put a pencil in my hand, and what she taught me was that I could learn to draw.
Yes.
So that was a skill I could learn if I wanted to put the 1,000 hours into learning it, or 10,000. But the ability to see color and how they work together was something I was never going to have.
Right.
It's not in my brain. My brain has always worked well around words. So it's a question of, okay, I have a starting point that's natural. I have a mind that is creative, and therefore the sort of the elements that you need that will allow you to say, maybe if I put in the 10,000 hours, I can be successful at this, are there. And the way, in terms of my own methodology, the way I discover it is whether at a point in time I ask myself, am I having fun doing it? Forget about whether I'm good or bad. Am I having fun? If the answer is yes, then I'm going to stay at it, and I'm going to figure out, okay, what are the technical issues I have to learn to get better at it? I started golf late in life, but again, it was something that I enjoyed doing. And for the first 10 years, in fact, I picked up some of my most important business clients on the golf course, including my 10-year, actually it was a close to a 15-year relationship with Lionsgate, was created on the golf course,
right?
Which is another anecdote. But it's because innately I was enjoying it, even when I was terrible at it, and I knew that if I could break it down into its tiniest components, that each component, if I figured out how to do it and then combine them, I would be yards and eventually miles ahead of where I started. But you have to like it.
I understand the natural preclusion. I understand the joy or finding some happiness in it. Or some enjoyment in it. But that's a lot of what you've described were things that you couldn't imagine enjoying. I will never write a book is a statement of saying I would never enjoy that, right? So that's what I'm asking is, like, what's the system that for you that got you over, I'm never going to do this because I would never enjoy it, to then saying, okay, I'm going to systematically work it out of how to do it. And at what point does the joy kick in?
It comes down to, from a writing perspective, and I think there's a larger lesson to be learned here that's universal. From a writing perspective, it comes down to the sentence. Can you write a sentence?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And if you can write a sentence, if you put 3 or 4 of them together, you have a paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So sentence by sentence, you form a paragraph. So can I write a book? No, of course not. Can I write a sentence? Of course.
So the
can I write a paragraph?
Though, is that breaking things down, in chunking things down. I get that, but I still don't get this piece around the finding the enjoyment, which is what you said is so important.
And here it is. When I wake up the next morning, and this is, a lot of writers say the same thing. When I wake up the next morning and I pick up what I look at the computer screen and I see what I wrote yesterday, and my initial reaction is, this is rubbish. All right. I don't know what I was thinking yesterday when I thought this was great. This is not great. And I can see how I can make the first sentence better. And then I can see how I make the second sentence better. And it's in the improvement that you could feel those endorphins. The dopamine is going in the head. And I am now reinforcing, oh my God, this is so much better than yesterday. And then I'll come back to it the next morning and say, what was I thinking? And I'll do this 100 times. And some people would say, you've reread the first chapter of your book 100 times. And I'd say, no, I've reread it more than that, because I get such enjoyment out of changing 2 words. Because I can see just how much better it is when I do it. But it's all it's all the chemical release in my brain that's turned into you can't do it to you must do it.
That's really good insight. Thank you for that. The name is an unusual name. Bacall, it's not a name that I had ever heard other than, of course, the very famous Lauren Bacall. And if you are maybe even under 40, you may never have heard of Lauren Bacall. But for Altacackers, old people like us, we know who she was. She was one of the great Hollywood screen actresses, incredibly famous. She was married to Humphrey Bogart, I
That's
believe.
right. That's right.
What's the connection?
So my grandmother was convinced that we were related, but when I read at least the first part of Miss Bacall's autobiography, it became clear that wasn't true.
Because it wasn't her name.
Other than the fact that our families both hailed from Romania, and possibly nearby, so there might have been some kind of relationship eventually, but our connection kicked in while I was still practicing, and at the point in time when I was sort of riding high in my film finance practices, I was doing a lot of financing work for Warner Brothers. And while my legal partners were going up to the cold north of Ontario and Quebec to visit their clients, I was getting on a plane and going down to Burbank to visit the Warner Brothers studios to work on deals. And we'd done one fairly exotic deal that involved a number of Hollywood pictures that had been that they had released. And of course, the deal itself attracted the ire of the Canada Revenue Agency, who came in to do a serious audit. And the auditors, who were actually very smart guys, figured out this was the opportunity for them to get a free trip to a Hollywood studio for 4 days. So they decided to take the audit south and go down and audit all the expenses of this transaction on the lot. And they were very well treated when they get there, but they get back, and a few weeks later, my partner and I get a call from Tax Avoidance Division in Ottawa saying, we've got a serious problem with this deal. And they don't tell us what it is, but by the tone of voice, we know there's a real problem here. So we go up to Ottawa, and we are met by the entire kitchen sink of senior tax officials in Ottawa, who are and they're out for blood. And the meeting opens up, and they say, we have a problem with the deal. We notice that there are huge payments going out to somebody in your family, Mr. Bacall. And we don't know why, but we called you up here because we want an explanation, and we want it immediately. And my partner says, can you send over the file? So he sends over the file. Well, he looks at them. He has this huge smile on his face, and he says, have you guys ever heard of Lauren Bacall, the actor?
Oh my God.
So fortunately, that settled the meeting in about 30 seconds.
So they thought you were skimming to your
that it was my
daughter
mother or my daughter or somebody like that.
And it was, oh my God.
It was payroll for her on one of the movies.
Oh my God. And so again, back to, if you're of a certain age, you know who Lauren Bacall is. If you're not, you're like,
yeah. So okay, what does that mean anyway?
So as we come towards the end of this conversation, you know, I always love to ask my guests to share something practical that they can walk away with, that they can put into action in the next 5 minutes, preferably, but certainly 24 hours, that becomes the practicality of the lessons of what you've shared here. I know you have a TED Talk, and again, we'll post a link to that, that goes through a lot of this stuff. You've got your books, but what's that nugget you want to leave people with?
It's a cross between my last career and my current career. And I write about it and I speak about it regularly. And I call them my 3 C's. And very quickly, whether it's your life or your business or your organization or any group you lead, I think they all revolve around 3 C's. The first C, which I think should be part of business strategy, is what is your culture?
Mm-hmm.
Others, what are your values that are important to you?
Yes.
The second C is how do you communicate them? And what's your storytelling within your organization or your group, or it could even be your family? How do you reinforce the values, not by simply stating them, but by telling stories about your life or other people who you admire that reinforce those values that are
Mm-hmm.
important? And the final C, which is more important than the first 2, and I'll explain why in a minute, is consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing to say it, and it's quite another thing to live it in your day-to-day activities. So it's fine to say, here's my cultural value, this is what we're about. But when the rubber hits the road, when it's time to take a step, when it's time to do a daily action, are you practicing it? Because if you're not, you're breeding cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the story that I wrote in Breakdown of an Organization, because ultimately the book is about how could something so successful fail so quickly? And the short answer was, we created a culture, we had values, we were communicating them, but in our final year, we weren't living them.
Fabulous. Great insight. What a great place to close it up. That was really powerful, and I would definitely encourage people to live by those 3 C's. Again, Norm, please tell people where they can find out more about you, about your TED Talk, about your books, etc., so they can reach out to you, maybe bring you in as a speaker. How can they do that?
That's
and I want to thank
lovely.
You
thank you. You can simply Google me. It's Norman Bacall, Bacal. And my website, which has all the information you need, including links to my books, sign up for my newsletter, whatever, is normanbacall.com. Norman, Bacal, all one word, .com. Pretty simple once you get the spelling right. And you can also find me on LinkedIn or email me at normbacall@gmail. That's also pretty simple. Norm as opposed to Norman. And the one thing I promise you, anyone who gets in touch with me, I respond to. You have a question, I will always answer it. It's part of my give back.
Fabulous. Thank you, Norm. It's been a pleasure and honor, sir. Hope you'll stay with us to the end. And for you, dear listener, remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders. You can chat about the show you've been listening to in our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Remember that those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of that tribe. Whether you're in business or in politics or any kind of committed to shaping the landscape, you can tap into what drives human behavior. You can use the groundbreaking understanding of applying the anatomy of meaning extracted from the emotional source code of your individuals, your organizations, and even your nation to transform that behavior. I'm Dov Barron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness your emotional source code to move their tribe, because unified, actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about what it is that you think you'll never do, that if you decided, you really could. If you just found out what the joy might be in it and how you might be able to give back. There's a whole new world waiting out there for you. Don't retire. In the words of Norman Bacall, rewire. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.